Today, I'm going to be talking about a question I get a lot, which is where should the yield management function report within a corporation or a company? Before I start, if you're enjoying the content, please give me a subscribe and a like. It really does help. Let's get going. The first thing we need to address is the purpose of the yield team before we can talk about where it should report. And I'm assuming that the purpose of the yield team is to ensure long-term profitability, primarily of a publisher, through successful pricing, auction mechanics, and relationship with partners. The second major assumption I'm making is that we want the yield team to be effective and to be empowered. This sounds like a silly assumption to have to write down, but I've seen situations where the owner or the team that is responsible for the yield team may not want the yield team to actually be that effective. The reporting structure matters. It matters for a couple of reasons. The first is that the career incentives that the people on the yield team have, the promotions, bonuses, etc., are tied to the reporting structure. And the second thing is that the effectiveness of the yield team is impacted by information flow. So which staff meetings do they sit in, etc., also impacts how effective they can be in the broader organization. And while some of the downsides that I'm going to talk about can be mitigated by dotted line reporting structures, etc., it's never really as effective as solid line reporting. So let's talk about the groups that the yield team interacts with the most. One of the main forms of interaction is with the sales organization. The sales team, of course, drives demand. They're going to request special pricing. They're going to have deal exceptions that they're going to request from the yield team. And this tends to be a group that the yield team interacts with a lot. A second major group that they interact with is finance. Finance is going to want to understand from the yield team, are we on track for our forecasts? Are we seeing the volume that we expect? Are we seeing the pricing that we expect? And this is going to be a two-way interaction around a lot of the budgeting and performance of the business. A third group, if it exists, and I acknowledge in some companies it may not, is a group around strategy and business ops who are doing the long-term planning. And the yield team is going to have a lot of input into those long-term plans and align on potential actions that a company can be taking. Our fourth group is product and engineering, which I group together here with the purpose of building products for the company. And here it's important that the yield team align on the roadmap for those partners and the potential revenue impact. And a fifth group is media properties. If this is a major publisher, the purpose of the media properties is to engage the users. And those media properties are going to be wanting to experiment with alternatives as to how they set up their web page or how they set up their app, where they position ads within the page. And the yield team is generally going to have a lot of interaction with that team. You can make the case, and I'm going to go through each of these groups in turn, that the yield team could live really within any of these different groups that are partners to the yield team. Because again, the yield team has to report somewhere. Because it's a group where we see it report a lot, I'm going to start with sales. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, you see the positives. On the right-hand side, you see the negatives. Let's start with the positives. The yield team, when it reports into sales, has a positive that the yield team can be very focused on top line revenue. And this can be a good thing. It can mean that the yield team can be empowered to drive initiatives that can result in more revenue for the company. It also can expose the yield team to the pressures and the market dynamics that the sales team experiences. One of the challenges for a yield team is often they can be sort of sitting in a back room without that direct exposure. And unless they're getting that first-hand experience of the market, they may be less impactful. And so there are some very good reasons why the yield team would sit within the sales organization. And indeed, we see this model still a lot. But there's also some really big negatives associated with it. The first is that the yield team may be more focused on revenue than on profitability. And in most companies, a CEO and other senior leaders would want their yield team to be thinking about the long-term profitability of a company rather than just driving revenue growth. Aligned with that, or very similar, is the notion that the yield team may become more focused on the same cycle that the sales team is on, which tends to be a quarterly cycle, rather than being longer term focused, which is generally where you want to have your yield team. And one of the most important issues is that the yield team, if it reports into sales, has no ability to push back on the head of sales. This is the classic moniker that's used is the fox is guarding the hen house. And it's a real challenge if your head of sales, head of yield does not have the ability to push back on the head of sales, then really the head of yield is beholden to the sales organization. And so for that reason, the fourth negative here is that if yield reports into sales, it has a weak ability to act as an independent steward of the business. And this is a role that we see the yield team taking on a lot, where they're viewed as an independent arbiter of some decisions. It's very hard to be that independent arbiter if you're sitting within a sales organization. So, an area that we see a lot, some very strong positives and some very strong negatives associated with being within the sales organization. And I think that the last thing I would say here is most sales leaders, with the exception of some very strong sales leaders that I've worked with, like to have the yield team report to them because they like the control. And so it's beholden on the other executives within an executive team to ensure that that doesn't happen. Another group that we should talk through is product and engineering. And these are groups that can take different forms. It's certainly a model that can occur. For many years at Yahoo, I was the head of yield and reported into a product and engineering function. And there are some also strong advantages and some pretty significant weaknesses. The strengths are that the yield team is better positioned to influence the product roadmap. They sit within the product organization, they're peers of the product and engineering leaders, and so they're really well positioned to have that product impact them. The second reason is that as our industry has moved more and more away from managed sales that are based on relationships into a programmatic environment where so much is driven by the decisions of product and engineering, the yield team within the product and engineering org has a great ability to influence how the data and the technology are used within that programmatic environment. Another advantage is that they're relatively independent from the sales pressures. So again, a lot of positives associated with being in a product and engineering org. There's a couple of major negatives associated with this. One is that the yield team tends to have a different skill set than the product and engineering leads. They tend to be more people who are sort of business analysts or data scientists, and they aren't really viewed as career engineers or product leaders. And so that could potentially have career challenges in terms of how they're leveled within organizations and other issues. The second concern is that by sitting in a product and engineering organization, there tends to be less direct engagement with the sales team. And so in some cases, there may be less context for some of the deals. Again, this can be mitigated through different relationships that need to be established, but just by not sitting in the sales organization, it's a concern that needs to be watched out for. A third place we see, and you can see here I've grouped at least 3 different groups: strategy, finance, business operations. They have mostly the same positives and negatives associated with them, so I've grouped them together. Again, the big plus here is that by sitting outside of a sales organization, you're independent from the sales pressures. A big positive is that there tends to be heavy skills overlap between the yield team and some of these other internal business functions, whether again it's strategy, finance, business operations. Many of the skills associated with forecasting, profitability analysis, deal review, etc., are very similar across these groups. The negative is similar to the negative I had on the previous screen, where you see less direct engagement with the sales team, so less context for some of those deals, and because you're not now within the product or engineering organization, less ability to influence the product roadmaps. I think in all of these models, you need to ensure that the teams that are part of Yield establish strong relationships with their partner organizations in order for the yield function to be successful. And then another group where it's possible for the yield team to sit is within a media property. An example would be where you're actually, rolling up to the GM of a property. This has the big plus that they tend to be close to the business that they are serving. And here the role will tend to be slightly different. This is an example where someone is working with a leader responsible for a web page or an app, and their role is primarily just how do I make sure that those properties are making as much money as possible. So in that sense, they're very close to the media owner. They tend to know the business. The large negative tends to be that it's a more limited scope role. They tend not to have the purview across the entire business. They're not usually involved in deal review functions. It tends to be a smaller yield team, possibly 1 or 2 people within a media property who are aligned against this function. And the skill set may be more aligned with other functions. A similar concept is the idea that you could have a yield team that rolls up to a country or a region leader. This is the idea, for example, that if you have largely separate operation, your US business, and you have separate operations within Europe, you create a yield team that rolls up to the country leaders or the European regional leaders. The big positive is that the yield team, again, knows that business very well. They're sitting in the same time zones. They know the challenges. It's good for their careers. But again, it tends to be a more limited scope role and tends to be a smaller yield team focused on very specific challenges. And the big negative here is you can end up with very different regional practices. I've certainly been in situations where there have been 3 or 4 different yield teams within a company, and they've operated reasonably successfully together. But then when you try to do some kind of global deal, you end up in situations where the regional practices just make those deals unmanageable. So, given all that, what's the right answer? And it really comes down to what you as an organization need the yield team to be doing. If you're a company that needs the yield team to be independent, you probably don't want it reporting into your sales organization. If you're a company that values global consistency, you're not going to fragment your yield management team and have it report into different regional leaders. If you're a company that needs your yield management team to be driving a lot of yield and profitability type initiatives and have it deeply embedded in the organization and the business, you're probably not going to choose to have it report into finance. At the end of the day, it really comes down to what you as an organization need for your yield management team to be focused on. I'm James Deaker. Thanks for watching.